Hans in the middle, or how would you like it?
Dear attendees, both here at Spui 25 and behind the computer at home, my name is Robin de Bruin, and I have the honor of acting as host to the speakers and to you this evening. I'm an historian at the European Studies Department of the University of Amsterdam, and tonight we will discuss Europeanness, colonization, decolonization, and European integration. The myth of a virgin birth of the European Union, the idea of post-war European integration as the demarcation of the dividing line between an old Europe, the Europe of the Second World War and colonial empires, and a new Europe, the peace-loving Europe of the European communities and the European Union. This virgin birth is still very much alive. And to give you an example, almost 6 years ago, in February 2020, shortly before the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, Charles Michel, who was the former president of the EU's European Council, gave a short speech at the official dinner of the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa. And in his speech, he emphasized to his audience of politicians from African countries that only a few EU member states, not Europe as a whole, had colonies. And according to Michel, the European communities and later the European Union broke with that imperial tradition. Your northern neighbor has changed, he said to his audience. Now, this virgin birth is still very much alive, despite the fact that over the past 2 decades, many researchers, including myself, have published about how the European communities of the 1950s, among other things, aimed to prolong the life of the French and the Belgian colonial empires. And moreover, this influence of imperialist attitudes in the process of European integration did not end with the independence of Algeria in 1962 and the formal independence of other African countries, because after 1962, many of the former colonies in Africa were put under pressure by France to remain associated with France and with the European communities. And over the next hour and a half, these speakers will discuss with each other and with you the idea that empire was not something that happened elsewhere, but that it made EU Europe what it is today, and that we need to be aware of this. And this discussion will also focus on Hans Koundani's assertion in his book Euro-Wideness that civic ideas about EU Europe are being supplanted by ethnic and cultural ideas about EU Europe. And Hans is an associate fellow and former director of the Europe program at the UK's Royal Institute of International Affairs. And in the past he has worked for the European Council on Foreign Relations. Important to mention this. He published several books and he writes regularly for The Guardian and Foreign Affairs, among others. And then Marcia Gonçalves, she is a historian of modern Europe and its colonial entanglements, and her current research explores the links between ideas of Europeanness and racial thought in overseas countries and territories. Then Nouri Kournas is a PhD researcher in our research program, Imperial Exceptionalism or Co-Imperialism, Imperial Powers and European Unity, and his research focuses on the Pan-European Union and the League of Nations between 1929 and 1939. And then Farid Boussaid, his academic work is mostly on the political economy of the Middle East, and he teaches courses on the Gulf states and North Africa. And he is also the director of the Amsterdam Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Hans will first give a short introduction, 15 minutes, to his book Euro-Whiteness, followed by Marcia, giving her opinion on that work based on her own project, then Nouri doing the same thing, and Farid as well, based on his research. And then Hans can respond for 10 to 15 minutes. And finally, there will be about 30 minutes for you to ask questions from the audience to all four speakers. And then there will be drinks, and you can have a chat with all speakers. Hans, your book Euro-Whiteness builds on well-known academic literature on the idea of Europe and literature that deals with the myth of the virgin birth of the European Union, but you clearly give your own polemical twist to the new insights in historiography. And in my opinion, your argument is often misrepresented or gets simplified, and you and I already discussed the most recent example of this. This can be found on page 228 of this book by Gerald and Francesca Knaus, who were guests here at SPUI 25 3 weeks ago. The book, What Europe Do We Need? A Political Miracle and How We Protect It from Its Enemies. And in their book, they write, and this is just an example, they write, and I quote in English what they write in German, and I quote, in his book Euro-Whiteness, author Hans Kundnani writes that the European project was a white, fundamentally racist endeavor aimed at saving the imperial states. Hans, can you please explain why this summary does not capture the spirit of your argument? And I also have a second question. My colleagues and I from the UVA's European Studies Department are criticized quite harshly in this book because, according to the authors, we do not pay enough attention to the political miracle of European integration. We should pay more attention to the lives and teachings of European saints, such as Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman. However, I do consider myself to be a critical observer of the European Union, but also a strong supporter of it. And you write in your book that you used to be a naive pro-European, and this suggests that you're no longer pro-European. And at the same time, you give the impression in your book as being somewhat Anglophile and rather forgiving of Brexit. How have the insights from this book, Euro-Whiteness, changed your political views about the European Union?
Thank you so much, Robin, for that setup and for the kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you both, Nouri and Robin, for organising this. It's a real treat to be able to discuss some of the ideas in my book with such a great panel. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So what I will try to do in 15 minutes or so is kind of outline the argument in the book. It's a very short book and it covers quite a lot of ground, so I'm going to kind of whiz through the argument and just kind of give you a sense of it, and then we can kind of drill down into whatever aspects of it you want to challenge me on. I'm not going to say too much about Brexit, which is the last chapter of the book. Maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. But maybe to actually begin, Robin, with your sort of question, it is a sort of the work of a sort of disillusioned pro-European. I worked, as you mentioned, for the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is a very pro-European foreign policy think tank. And when I started working there, I was a pro-European. I thought I understood the EU, but actually I didn't in retrospect. And it was really during the time that I spent there that I kind of learned more about the EU, particularly the history of the EU. And this gets us to Pia Hansen and Stefan Jonsson's book, Eurafrica. I remember reading that, and it really transformed my understanding of the origins of the European Union, that early phase of European integration. And I was quite struck by how, years after that book came out in 2014, it hadn't seemed to sort of penetrate actually into the world that I was in, a world of EU people, who were considered EU experts and were quoted, in the New York Times and the Financial Times. I mean, people like Gerald Knaus actually. They weren't aware of this history, and so they could state in quite a naive, to come back to that word I used, in quite a naive way that the EU is a post-colonial project, or it's even an anti-colonial project, right? And as we know from the work of various people like Pia Hansen and Stefan Jonsson and others, even just in chronological terms, it's wrong to say that the EU is a post-colonial project, because it didn't begin after European colonialism ends. It coincides with the early phase of European integration, coincides with the last phase of European colonialism. Let alone, as I say, the idea that it's an anti-colonial project. So I sort of wanted to write something that would try to, join the dots, but also go even further in a way than Pia Hansen and Stefan Jonsson did in challenging some of the myths about European integration. So it's basically a book about, the simplest way to put it is it's a book about ideas of Europe throughout history, and where the European Union, European integration fits into that longer history of ideas of Europe. And in particular, what I try to do is I propose that we think about the European Union, European integration as an expression of what I call regionalism. Some people want to think, pro-Europeans want to think about the EU and European integration as an expression of cosmopolitanism. But for example, when you say, I'm a European, you're not saying I'm a citizen of the world. In other words, it's not an expression of cosmopolitanism. You're saying I'm a citizen of this very particular region called Europe. So, although clearly, European integration is meant to overcome nationalism, move beyond nationalism, European identity is not the opposite of nationalism. I think it's actually quite analogous to nationalism, except on a larger continental scale. And so, as I say, I propose this idea of regionalism, which is somewhat like nationalism, except, as I say, on a larger continental scale. And part of the reason I think it's helpful to think about Europe and European identity and the European Union in that way is because it means that all of the intellectual resources that we have from the study of nationalism, we can sort of not necessarily directly apply to regionalism, but we can at least think about whether they work in a somewhat similar way for regionalism. So to give you, one very simple example, one of the most influential ways now we think about nations is as imagined communities, from Benedict Anderson. And I would suggest that Europe is also an imagined community. It may be a somewhat different imagined community, but it is also an imagined community. And in particular, the distinction that I use in the book is this distinction which comes from the study of nationalism between ethnic nationalism on the one hand and civic nationalism on the other hand. And I try to apply that to the history of Europe. It seems to me that in the history of these ideas of Europe, there's been this complex interaction between, I use the term ethnic/cultural rather than just ethnic, because I think culture and ethnicity bleed into each other, always have done. And so I think it's more precise to say ethnic-cultural rather than just ethnic. But it seems to me that in the long history of ideas of Europe, there's been a complex interaction between these ethnic-cultural ideas of Europe on the one hand and civic ideas of Europe on the other hand, in a very similar way to the way that I think has happened in the history of thinking about nations. So the story begins ultimately in classical antiquity, where this idea of Europe as a space comes from, the name Europe comes from. But European identity, in other words, thinking about people as Europeans, really begins in the medieval period. And specifically in something called the Mozarabic Chronicle in the 8th century. This seems to be the first reference that we have to the idea of people being Europeans. And the Mozarabic Chronicle is an account of the Battle of Poitiers, or the Battle of Tours. And in this account, in Latin, the people who are referred to as being Europenses, in other words, Europeans, are the Franks, in other words, the forerunners of today's French. But in that reference to Europenses, they're being contrasted with with Arab forces. And so I think this is important to stress, that there's an othering of Muslims from the beginning of the idea of European identity. Throughout the medieval period, Europeanness is roughly synonymous with Christianity. What happens over the course of centuries is that initially at the time of the Mozarabic Chronicle, very few people are using this term European. It gradually starts to be used more frequently as a synonym for Christian, but gradually starts to replace it, as I say, over the course of several centuries. And the figure who is really the embodiment of that medieval idea of Christianity that's synonymous with, of Europeanness, which is synonymous with Christianity, is the figure of Charlemagne, who, by the way, is the grandson of Charles Martel, who's the hero of the Battle of Poitiers or Battle of Tours. And so I think you can already see, Charlemagne becomes, in the post-war period, this emblematic, inspirational figurehead for the European integration, which I think already suggests that this idea of European as Christian continues, not just past the medieval period, but into post-war Europe. Then in the modern period, in other words, from roughly 1450 onwards, you begin to get a much more complex idea of Europeanness, which emerges in the context of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And so it's a much more rationalist or secular idea of Europeanness as opposed to a religious one. But I think it's also important to say that it emerges also in the context of the encounter of Europeans with the populations of Africa and Asia, and especially the Americas after 1492. In other words, the context in which the idea of whiteness emerges. So as well as being a rationalist idea of Europe as opposed to a religious one, it's also a racialized idea of Europe. And it's in this context, the period then of European colonialism, that the idea of a European civilizing mission emerges. In the medieval period, there's already an idea of a kind of European mission, but it's a religious mission to convert people, and then it becomes what we now recognize as being a civilizing mission in the modern period. But in particular, it's this idea that there are values that are European in origin, but they have universal applicability, and so you have a kind of a duty almost to export them. And so the question becomes, and this is really the question that the book tries to answer, is, well, what happens after 1945? Do these ethnic cultural ideas connected to Christianity, connected to whiteness, just disappear after 1945? As Robin was suggesting, that 1945 is a kind of a hour zero, a sort of clean break with this past, a completely new idea, a purely civic idea of Europe emerges. That's what a lot of pro-Europeans want to believe. But as I've already suggested with the figure of Charlemagne, the history is much messier than that. So what I try to do in the book is to sort of tell the story of European integration, and I have a sort of periodization of 3 phases. So I'll very, very quickly run through those. So the first phase is basically the Cold War period from 1945 to 1990. And, the crucial thing to say here, and Robin has already talked about this, is that this early phase of European integration begins as a colonial project. It's not, as I say, doesn't happen after the end of European colonialism. It intersects with it. So in that sense, it's not a post-colonial project, even in a chronological sense. But it's not just that. It's that part of the point of European integration, and this is what various scholars like Pia Hansen and Stefan Jonsson have very clearly shown, and I should really emphasize this. I haven't really added anything to this in my book. This is the work that has been done by others. But what they show very clearly is that part of the point of European integration in that early phase was for France and Belgium to consolidate, to integrate, if you like, their remaining colonies in Central and West Africa at a time when they were no longer able to maintain them on their own. So I call this the original sin of European integration, consciously analogizing to the role of slavery in the founding of the United States. Now, that formal colonial project does end fairly quickly, by about 1960. And so I think there's still, very much an open question, which we might get into, in fact, I think we will get into, about whether after that the European Union, what becomes the European Union, is a neo-colonial project, And for example, there's a book by Véronique Dimier called Recycling Empire, which looks at how the title suggests, absolutely that it's a neocolonial project. This looks at the role of EU development policy and shows how French colonial officials, were essentially running that from the beginning. That's not something I particularly look at in the book. Instead, I look at the way that after the loss of these last French and Belgian colonies in Africa, actually something more like a civic identity emerges. And it's based on, in particular, on the social market economy and the welfare state, in other words, a kind of a socio-economic kind of model, and on this depoliticized mode of governance that European integration produces, so a political model. In that context, though, this whole history of European colonialism is, and the role of what becomes the EU in it, is forgotten, even as the memory of the Holocaust from the 1960s onwards, but especially from the 1980s onwards, starts to become really central to the whole narrative of the EU. And so the way I put this in the book is that the EU becomes based on the internal lessons of European history. In other words, what Europeans have done to each other, centuries of conflict culminating in World War II and the Holocaust. And it's quite easy to integrate the Holocaust into that story, not least because it takes place in the context of World War II. But the external lessons of European history, in other words, what Europeans have done to the rest of the world, is not part of the story. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think there's something structural going on here, which is that European integration encourages Europeans to think about their history in terms of their relationships with each other. So it becomes this kind of idea of European history as a kind of closed system, a completely self-contained history that's cut off from the histories of, for example, above all, Africa and the Middle East, with which there have been lots of interactions throughout history. And so I think the EU becomes a vehicle for imperial amnesia. So that's the first phase, the sort of Cold War period. Then the next phase is the sort of 20-year period after the end of the Cold War. And what happens in this context is that the EU starts to go into this quite expansive, optimistic kind of mode. This is in the context of the enlargement of the EU to include Central and Eastern European countries. And against this background, pro-Europeans start to imagine that they can almost remake the whole of the world in the image of the EU. So it's a kind of a quite hubristic kind of moment. I think there are at least two problems with this. One is that it leads precisely, I think, to a revival of this idea of a European civilizing mission, a kind of postmodern technocratic version of this idea of a civilizing mission. Jan Zielonka has written about this in the context of the enlargement as a sort of new European civilizing mission. But the other thing that's really problematic about it is that even as the EU's borders to the east soften as Central and Eastern European countries join, its borders to the south remain very hard. So in particular, Morocco applies to join what is then the EEC in 1987, and it's just told flatly that you can't because you're not a European state, regardless of what economic and political reforms you undertake. And so I think this strengthens the idea that the EU is a white bloc. Now, Turkey is a particularly interesting case because it's in the southeast of Europe, in other words, sort of between the east and the south. And so as you would then expect, unlike Morocco, it is allowed to apply and even become a candidate country, but the accession process stalls, and pro-Europeans would say, and the EU said, well, this is because Turkey didn't undertake the necessary economic and political reforms. But it's fairly clear that something civilizational is going on as well. And just to give you one example of that, which is particularly relevant since we're speaking in the Netherlands, Frits Bolkestein, who I think is a very central figure in Dutch politics in the last several decades. Incidentally, Geert Wilders starts out by working for Bolkestein. It's kind of Bolkestein. Bolkestein is kind of his mentor. He says in 2004, if Turkey were allowed to join the EU, it would mean, quote, that the liberation of Vienna in 1683 would have been in vain, right? Which illustrates how this medieval idea of Europeanness that's synonymous with Christianity, lives on, via the conflicts between the Habsburg Empire and the Ottoman Empire, but lives on into the EU itself. So that's the second phase, and then that second phase comes, I think, to a fairly abrupt end with the beginning of the Euro crisis in 2010. That brings us to the sort of the final and current phase that we're in now. And I think what happens is that the EU goes into a much more defensive kind of mode after the Euro crisis and the series of other crises that it faces in the years after that. and it starts to see itself as being surrounded by threats, and so the language of protection starts to come into the EU. You may remember Emmanuel Macron's idea of l'Europe qui protège, the Europe that protects. The refugee crisis in 2015, exactly a decade ago, I think is the second critical juncture, perhaps an even more important one. I think in retrospect we can see how that is a critical juncture that's really transformed the EU. And I think what's happened since then is that the EU has come to see these threats to it in civilizational terms. In civilizational terms. So I talk in the book about the civilizational turn in the European project. This is against the background of the rise of the far right throughout Europe, and also the way that the centre-right, and this country is a very good example of how this has happened, the centre-right increasingly mimicking the rhetoric and policies of the far right, especially on these questions around identity and immigration and Islam. And it's against this background that, as Robin suggested, it seems to me at least, that these ethnic cultural ideas of Europe that are connected to Christianity, connected to whiteness, have been becoming stronger rather than weaker. And it's those ethnic cultural ideas of Europe that I call Euro-whiteness. I think I'll stop there for now, and we can come back to the Brexit question in the discussion afterwards.
Good evening, everyone. I am not an historian of the European Union. Yes, I'm short, I know. And I am not also an historian of the process that creates the European Union. Nevertheless, I was very enthusiastic when I was invited to take part in this panel. I thank Nuri and Robin for the invitation. Thank you very much, and I thank you all for coming. Even though I'm not academically focused on the European Union, it had been with great interest that I had added Anne's book, Euro-Whiteness, to my to-read list after coming across a piece, I believe, in The Guardian back in 2023. Back then, I was in the early stages of my most recent research project, which was funded by the European Union with a Marie Curie fellowship, individual fellowship. The project was titled Gradients of Europeanness in Colonial Africa. So in a way, I was also researching that ethnic and cultural version of Europeans' identities that might be called Euro-whiteness, but in a colonial context during the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries. More specifically, my geographical focus is the Congo Free State, the colony added by Leopold II, King of the Belgians, but which was not a Belgian colony until 1908. In the meantime, I have realized that beyond the bubble of historians of empire in which I usually move, many people don't know that because the Congo Free State was established following the Berlin Conference, during the Berlin Conference actually of 1884 and 1885, which was actually one of the most striking examples of co-imperialism in modern history, perhaps in history. So the Congo Free State, because it was created in that context, had to comply with very specific rules that set it apart from other colonies. It had been agreed in Berlin that the Congo had to grant free access to any individual, any company, any religious mission, anything that wanted to settle in the Congo, despite of not being Belgian, regardless of their national origin, had to be allowed to settle there. Preference to Belgians could not be given by the Belgian king. The Belgian prime minister at the time even said that, well, this is not a Belgian colony, this is sort of an international colony. And while Leopold II would find some ways to give preference to Belgians in the following decades, the Congo attracts Europeans from many, many origins, united in the common project of exploiting the territory and its people. Many, even Dutch people arrived. Some were already there, actually, some Dutch companies. Many Portuguese were already there, and many others arrived. Many Italians joined the official forces of Leopold II. Many Italians also become the doctors available in the Congo. Many Scandinavians, particularly Swedes, moved to the Congo. Some Polish people moved to the Congo. The most famous is Joseph Conrad. That's why we have the Art of Darkness. So something good came out from that. And Jacques Michel would be surprised with the number of people from Luxembourg. Actually, some decades later, they would even enter the Congo Free State with a very privilegious status, almost akin of the Belgium themselves. PhD thesis is actually being written about the people from Luxembourg in the Congo Free State. Kevin, I don't remember his surname, but it's being written. So there were a lot of Europeans in the Congo. Some people say it was a cosmopolitan hub because unlike other colonies, there were so many people, so many Europeans from so many places. It's actually often argued in colonial and imperial historiography that in colonial societies, class and national difference between European people were erased. Regardless of where they come, their commonalities were emphasized in contradiction to the colonized people. We, the superior Europeans, against them, the inferior Africans or Asians or Americans. And yet, even before I had started my project, I kept encountering brief references in the literature, in historical studies on Belgian colonialism, suggesting that some Portuguese were driving the Belgian colonial authorities in the Congo nuts. Not every Portuguese. Not the wealthy merchant in Boma or in the city that would later become Kinshasa. But the petty traders who lived in African neighborhoods or in the hinterlands, they were driving the Belgian nuts. Those were the problem. They were referred to as second-class Europeans. They were obviously superior to Africans, but not quite European. They were swart Europeans or even dirty whites. It was feared that their presence in the colony would endanger the prestige of the colonizer in the eyes of the colonizer. They didn't keep the hierarchy in place. So class and national origin still matter after all. I would find in the following years that it was actually even much more complex. There was a proper way of being an European, and these Portuguese, these dirty Portuguese, that were not wealthy and that they did not behave according to what was expected from them as Europeans, were thus less European at the eyes of the European authorities ruling the Congo. And it was from there that I came to read Anne's book in 2023. I came to your book looking for the gradients of Euro whiteness. Hans mentioned today how ethnic and cultural ideas of Europe seem to be getting stronger after refugee crisis in 2015, and they are becoming to be formulated in terms of civilization. In the book, there is also, and it was not mentioned today, but there is also a reflection on how the refugee crisis created a divide between Western and Eastern member states, as the Euro crisis had created a divide between northern and southern member states a few years before. But while in the book the eastern and western divide was associated with the revival of the old and long-lasting idea that Eastern Europe was not quite Europe yet, so there was a cultural divide between those two Europes, Eastern and Western. In the book, the North-South divide was presented in economic terms, a divide between creditors and debtors, between the rich North and the poor South. Back then, I found that puzzling, not only as an historian and as a researcher on historical constructions of Europeanness, but also because I, as a Portuguese, had a different memory of the Euro crisis and the public debates that ensued after the Euro crisis. When the Portuguese government formally requested external aid in April 2011, I was doing my PhD at the European University Institute. For non-academics in the room, probably you have never heard about the European University Institute, or the EUI as we call it. It's an international doctoral and postdoctoral research-intensive university. It was founded by the member states in the 1970s. I don't remember the exact year. It is still funded by the EU member states and by the European Commission itself, with doctoral students, postdocs, and professors coming from all Europe. It's as pro-European as it gets. Well, but even in this very pro-European environment, the conversations with colleagues were sometimes sprinkled with ideas that reflect a widespread perception of a cultural and historical divide between the North and the South of Europe. Moreover, what I was hearing in the 21st century sounded a bit like what I was finding in the archives while doing research about interwar plans to reshuffle the colonial distribution for my thesis on Portuguese national identity and how colonialism shaped Portuguese national identity in the 1930s. The idea that, well, the Portuguese haven't reached the European standards yet served both to claim that they should have never been part of the Eurozone in the first place, and to claim that the Portuguese colonies should be redistributed because then the Portuguese did not have what it takes to be a colonizer, to civilize the natives. That was the argument in the late 1930s. The media coverage of the Euro crisis, as far as I remember, did not only reflect a perception that there was a cultural and historical divide between Northern and Southern European. It actually reflected also perception that there was a racial divide between Northern and Southern Europe. If the Western and Eastern divides can be put in oversimplistic terms as they might look European, but they are not fully European in a cultural sense, the North and South divide would be kind of, they don't even look European at all. As the European Union adopts a more defensive and exclusive stance, presenting itself more and more as the guardians of a distinct European way of life, who has and has not the right and the privilege of defining what being an European means, remains as contentious within Europeans themselves as in the late 19th century Congo. I would like to end with a little provocation. Hans, one of your points is that the EU has been a vehicle for imperial amnesia, and colonialism has been seen as a problem of the national states rather than the EU, even though the European project was a colonialist project when it was created. As an historian of colonialism, let alone a Portuguese one, I wonder to what extent there was really an imperial amnesia ever, and colonialism was seen as a problem of the national states, or if the real issue here is that the colonial past was not even seen as a problem at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcia, for opening the discussion, and also Hans for your words. I would like to begin by praising Euro-whiteness, and especially for that last point, for showing us and revealing how the European Union has often served as a vehicle for imperial amnesia, a way for Europe to forget its colonial past. And tonight I want to make 2 points in response, or you could say in addition, as an opener for a further clarification. And those 2 points that I want to make are, first, while whiteness has become important to European identity, as you just mentioned, throughout the ages, Christianity, even in its secularized cultural form, I would say, continues to define who belongs. And then the second point is that I believe that this religious dimension has shaped both Europe's colonial past and its contemporary anxieties about Islam and about migration. And I will come back to this in a bit. Hans, you begin the book by actually situating yourself, some would call it positionality. You describe Euro-whiteness, this book, as a personal project also, written by the son of an Indian father and a Dutch mother, and being a British citizen. You say you've always felt somewhat European, but never fully so, and I understand this feeling very well. As the son of 2 immigrant Turkish Muslims living in the Netherlands, I too have always felt partially European. But unlike you, I must still speak in the first person plural, we Europeans, because the Netherlands didn't vote for Nexit last week. So I understand that feeling very well, but the we in we Europeans is never simple. At least, I think so. Because there are hidden conflicts within the EU of people who live in Europe, but are still considered as non-EU nationals, people with full citizenship. We see this every day. In 2020, 5 right-wing political parties in the Netherlands voted against this motion, a motion simply affirming that Islam is part of the Netherlands and that Muslims have full rights as equal citizens. There were 5 parties voting against this motion. In 2023, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, in front of her British colleague, described Islam as incompatible with Europe and European civilization. And the endless talk, of course, of a Judeo-Christian culture as opposed to an alien Islamic one is also part of everyday business in newspapers and in public debate. Some might explain this rhetoric as the consequence of 9/11 or 7/7 in London, or the 2nd of November in the Netherlands, the murder of Van Gogh. But Euro-whiteness shows that these ideas have much deeper roots, that their roots are actually in the period before the Second World War. And one of the central arguments of the book is also that the EU inherited the idea of a civilizing mission. And I think it's a persuasive argument, because even after decolonization, Europeans, the European Union, thought of itself as the bringer of justice, order, progress to the rest of the world. When Josep Borrell, for instance, speaks of the garden of Europe as opposed to the jungle outside Europe, this becomes very clear. It echoes that colonial mindset and the civilizing mission which it inherited. But if we follow this logic and we take a closer look at the interwar period where this civilizing mission was promoted by the pan-European movement, by others who believed in Europe, I read how Europe's civilizing mission was often explicitly also framed as a moral and a religious duty. This guy on the slide is Lord Lugard. He is basically the most prominent British colonialist of the interwar period. He sat in Nigeria, in Hong Kong, in different places. He sat in the Permanent Mandates Commission of the League of Nations, and others saw him really as the godfather of all the colonialists. And he wrote a book, The Dual Mandate, in 1924, and this book has been called The Bible of the Permanent Mandates section of the League of Nations. So really a quite important book. And in this book, he describes his work on colonial Africa and European imperialism in Africa as a competition between two world forces. On the one hand, militant Islam, and on the other, the European powers, who were tasked in the name of God Almighty to protect the indigenous populations and bring peace and civilization to Africa. This highlights that Europe's self-image as a civilizing power was not just about governance, economy, and these kind of things, but also about religion and about moral forces, defining itself against Islam, not only in the 1800s, but still in the interwar period as well. More specifically, I would say even in the interwar period. Lugard described the mandate system, which was established after the First World War, as the closing chapter of the long struggle between two rivalries, the forces of Islam, militant Islam, and the European nations. After the First World War, these mandates, and especially the A-class mandates, so basically West Asia, we call that the Middle East, brought many more Muslims under European administration, specifically in the interwar period. And it reinforced anxieties about both European unity and the global influence of this other force against whom Europeans defined their own civilizing mission. So when in chapter 2 we begin by saying European was synonymous to being Christian, to be a European was to be Christian, and out of this medieval context emerges the notion of a distinct European identity which gradually transformed in the modern era. I think that we are missing a continuity over here. During this period, yes, new conceptions of Europe arise under the Enlightenment, defined not by religion, but also by reason and secularism. But this doesn't necessarily have to contrast the medieval period of Christian Europe. And I'm happy that you talked about this in your talk. You do less so in the book, but we might as well come back to this later during the discussion. When Europeans in European colonialism encountered others in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, Europeanness became intertwined with whiteness, we read in the book. Both concepts emerged together, reinforced each other around the same time, the emergence of the idea of whiteness and the modern idea of a European identity reinforced one another. From the perspective of those outside Europe, the conflation was clear, and then the examples being given of apartheid South Africa, where a sign saying whites only or Europeans only basically meant the same thing. Yet religion, and I would say particularly Islam, never fully disappeared as a marker of European identity. The governance of Muslim subjects in colonial territories, especially under the mandate system, which this guy is also talking about, Lord Lugard, made this clear. Europeans often perceived Muslims as a global political threat and a religious force against whom they defined themselves. And this heightened anxiety about European unity. Resistance in colonies from Indonesia to Morocco, and especially in the newly created mandates in the interwar period, were not only seen as anti-imperialistic, anti-European, but also as anti-Christian. And this is an important point which needs to be made as well. This drove calls for greater European cooperation and greater European cohesion, and shaped also pan-European thinking, this idea of a civilization under threat by whom? Also still by this other Islamic force which we thought we had defeated as Europeans with the civilizing mission and the installed mandate system. And this brings me to the Dutch case. The Dutch Empire provides a striking example. When we look at colonial law and when this was codified, I see that Europeans were defined in colonial law not only by their race, but also by their faith. In the colonial system in the Dutch East Indies, the Dutch colony, there were initially in 1854 two groups installed, two legal categories. The Europeans, Europeanen, and the inlanders, the natives or the indigenous people. And when you look at these categories when they were codified, you see that Christians were equated with Europeans, whereas Mohammedans or pagans were equated with the native population. So the first codification in the Dutch context, Dutch colonial context, was a codification based on the separation of religion. Well, you could say this was early onwards, 1854, but this system endured well into the 1930s. And more importantly, with the mandate system also in the 1930s, this administration over Muslim populations in European colonies, in European mandates, became even more crucial and important. So by the 1930s, Europe's self-image as a Christian bloc, I would say, was opposed not only to communism, but also still to Islam. It never went away. And Count Coudenhove-Kalergi, who was the president of the Pan-European movement, one of the fathers of the Pan-European idea, even warned against communism as a new red jihad. And he saw Islam and communism as twin threats in the 1930s to Europe. So Islam never really disappeared from the picture. So I would agree, yes, whiteness became a key marker of identity, but this also included religion and more specifically the fear of Islam. This never went away. It continued also to define the boundaries of Europe. And this self-perception shaped by this rule over others, I would say, is also interesting because it shows how Europeans uniquely saw themselves as responsible for civilizing their colonies, but also against another power, so defining itself in this task against another world force. Christianity defined the in-group, Islam defined the out-group, reinforcing a European identity built as much on faith as on race. And I want to conclude by saying that this pattern persists today. Contemporary anxieties about Islam and debates about migration, integration, or so-called European values are the afterlives of these older entanglements, which were always there. Figures like Geert Wilders and Thierry Baudet, for instance, openly atheists or agnostics, still speak of defending Christian civilization. And I think this has much deeper roots. Leaders like Orbán or politicians in Poland refuse explicitly and specifically Muslim refugees when they're talking about migration. And Euro-whiteness captures the essential role of all of this, but it could go further, I would say, by adding religion to its title, despite maybe it already meaning religion with the cultural ideas, but I would have seen it rather more explicitly mentioned. And to conclude to this great book and its great achievement, it is not only about Europe as such, but also about who counts as European. And for us, the partially European, this is also about who we as Europeans are allowed to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll try to keep it short so we can open up the discussion. So Nouri and Robin, thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this panel and to share the stage with you all on this topic. Much ink has been spilled on the EU, on Brexit, but this book really added like fresh insight or things that I hadn't really thought about. So really thank you for that, Hans. It's very rare these days that you read a book that makes you ponder your own convictions and premises. So I feel a bit of an imposter. Like, I mean, what is there for me to add to this panel and to the book's main conclusion and insights? So bear with me. I would like to share with you some of my thoughts that I have been floating in my head when I was reading this book. And it will not be a neat academic contribution, rather a messy journey of my own thought process. So our societies are facing multiple crises. I mean, there's a clear ecological crisis. I think it was historian Adam Tooze who said that we are living through a polycrisis. We have an ecological crisis. We're living in the age of genocide, but it's in Gaza or in Sudan at the moment. And of course, our political democratic institutions are under attack. I mean, a lot of people are celebrating the election outcome here in the Netherlands. I wouldn't be that optimistic. But as an economist, I would like to add something to the book, and it is more about the global economic transformations that have been going on. So Hans' book really looks at the Euro crisis of 2010 and what it did to the European project. And I think your edition is very good about the way Northern Europeans, the more frugal states, look to the Southern Europeans. And the Dutch have a pretty bad reputation when it comes to that. Referring, for example, to Southern Europeans as lazy. I think he was our Minister of Finance, who was also the chairman of the Eurozone at that moment. And I think he has been pretty bad, has a bad reputation in Spain, Italy, and Portugal, precisely, and Greece, of course, because of those comments. But I would like to go back a bit further than just the Eurozone crisis. And this is also about the story about the global South. So for this journey, I would like to take you back to a battlefield in northern Italy, the Battle of Solferino in 1859. It is there that a man appeared and saw the horse of war, the Swiss man Henri Dunant. And he would then, what he saw there on that battlefield, he would use his pen and his connections to see what he could do to stop this type of warfare. And he's the one, of course, that has been always said as the one who founded the Red Cross, and has been a driving force behind establishing treaties between countries that would regulate warfare, and in a sense laying the basis for the Geneva Conventions. He won the first Nobel Peace Prize in 1901, a prize that is still eluding the occupier of the White House at the moment. Yet few people know why Dunant was there on that battlefield. He was not a soldier, neither was he a doctor, nor was he a politician. He was a businessman. And he was there on a business venture. And at the time, he was a general manager of a subsidiary of a company called Colonie Suisse de Sétif. For those of you who know their geography, Sétif is a town in Algeria, which was then being put under control of France. So the man heralded as the inspiration for the establishment of international humanitarian law accidentally stumbled on his life mission while he was involved in a colonial project. So it is the story of Algeria that we would like to turn to. So Hans did a great job in telling us how France saw the European project and the place of the Algerian colony in it. And here I would also like to make a comment that you made about how France looked at Algerians and how they classified people. To my knowledge, you had the French and settlers, of course, from Malta, from all kind of other places, and then the citizens or the subjects of Algeria were called Muslim. They were not called Algerians or Jews, Muslims or Jews. So that is quite an interesting addition to what you say about the way the colonizers looked to these people. They didn't call them Algerians, neither did they call them Arabs or Amazigh or anything. They classified them along religious lines. Yeah? So the part of his European history that it included Algeria and Congo when it was formed is often neglected. But there's a different or another indirect effect Europe had on Algeria and the Third World in general. And that is through its normative power regarding human rights. And I think that is part of its civilizing mission that it sought for itself. So Algeria, as you may know, emerged from a brutal decolonization war against the French and became like an iconic country in the Third World. Its capital, Algiers, was often described as a mecca for revolutionaries, people from the Black Panthers to all kind of other movements in sub-Saharan Africa or from Asia flocked to Algiers. Algeria had, of course, the benefit of oil and gas, so it became also an economic power in the 1970s. And it was one of those countries that was instrumental in the oil price hike of 73 and later 79, which was, of course, disastrous for the West and the Europe in general. But it was also a leading country in trying to establish a new economic international order. By collectively using the global south, or back in those days we used to call it the third world, to collectively argue that we need to change the way we have organized our trade and all kind of missions. So it's a fight. Decolonization did not stop yet. So the Western economies were in a mess, and this is also where we have the neoliberal turn, and which is interesting the moment that Britain joins the European Union, and it does something to the European Union and its socio-economic, social democratic features. So neoliberalism becomes the main feature of economic policy. It starts, a lot of people think it started with Thatcher and Reagan, but it actually started in Chile. The first real experiment was in Chile, then it traveled back to the Western core, Thatcher in the UK, Reagan, and then of course through the European Union also to other countries. But the issue I think I would like to, that people forget, is that this rise of neoliberalism coincided with the emphasis on human rights. And following work by Moyne, White, and Galvin, one could argue that this is not a coincidence. And so by focusing on individual human rights, the US and the European Union was trying to put the Third World and the Soviet Union on the back foot. These countries were authoritarian. And so by focusing on individual human rights, they kind of undermined the collective effort of these Third World countries to challenge the West and the West hegemony. I think it was in your book on page 101 that you mentioned the Declaration of European Identity in 73. It's no coincidence it happened in 1973. And so economic justice that could be pursued collectively was undermined. This push for more equitable international order was undermined precisely by focusing on individual human rights. It is thus an irony that the current global Palestine solidarity movement is embracing exactly the same discourse of human rights against European complicity. It's also an irony that the ideological founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, called Henri Dunant, the founder of the Red Cross, the first Christian Zionist. So my argument to conclude is not an argument against human rights or international humanitarian law. They are important that they are there. It is rather a cautionary tale of how human rights discourse had instrumental value for example, the European Union to undermine the collective effort for economic justice worldwide. And collective justice on a global scale, but also on a national scale. We have all know what happened to the unions when Thatcher took power in the 1980s. And so we are now living in an age increasingly characterized by oligarchy, with the political power of big tech epitomizing the latest iteration of this. And the European Union that is still grappling with its role in a shifting geopolitical and economic world. Economic stagnation here combined with the rise of populism. But more importantly, with the reputation of the European Union regarding human rights and international law in complete tatters. So I'd like to finish with a small anecdote. I was working in the Dutch Ministry of Finance between 2001 and 2006, so after 9/11, and the European Union was involved in a huge project to bring democracy to the Middle East and North Africa, to bring economic aid with good governance and all of these things. And participating in a lot of these conferences and meetings, I noticed the very relatively meek and subservient attitude of the ministers of finance from the countries in North Africa and the Middle East. 20 years later, that attitude has changed. A minister of finance from Morocco or Algeria sitting in a conference nowadays will have a completely different attitude towards the European Union. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about exactly that changed attitude and how the European Union is responding to that. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Hans, would it be possible to give a very short reply to the points made by the speakers?
Yes, I'm going to be like extremely brief, partly because I'm conscious of the time and I want to give you a chance to make some comments and questions of your own, but also because I mean, thank you so much for your responses. I feel as if you sort of added to the story I'm telling rather than directly challenging it, so I don't feel the need to say a whole lot in response. So I think for example, Nuri, I mean, I completely agree that, you know, religion, and specifically Islam, never fully disappears. I'm simply trying to suggest that in the modern period you get a much more complex idea of European identity, which encompasses lots of different things, right? Whiteness is part of it, there's also this rationalist component, but I'm certainly not suggesting that the religious component ever went away. It just gets folded into, I think, something that's much more complex. And, you know, if we had time, we could have a longer conversation about, you know, how we understand the relationship between, you know, culture and ethnicity and religion. I think they're all so intertwined that it's quite difficult actually to pull them apart. And actually, when I use the term whiteness, I would include religion within that, actually. So we could have that longer conversation, but I essentially agree with you, I think. So I think all I want to add is one thing, really, which just to, in a way, just to join the dots a little bit between some of the things that have been said. So, so Marcia, you talked about the Berlin Conference, and Nuri, you talked about Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, and Fareed, you talked about Dunant as the first winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. So all I want to just add is that Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, who, as you mentioned, was this sort of inspirational figure, I mean, the key figure in the interwar pan-European movement, and then an inspirational figure for the post-1945 European integration project. He's the first winner of the Charlemagne Prize, right, awarded every year in the name of Charlemagne, which again, you know, an illustration of the sort of continuities going back to the medieval period. It's idea of Europeanness that's synonymous with Christianity. And Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi says that his vision for European integration is in the spirit of the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, right? In other words, precisely this idea of co-imperialism, you know, the idea is very much that, you know, not against colonialism as such, just against the competitive aspect of colonialism, right? If we can just overcome the collective aspect and do it collectively, cooperate with each other as Europeans, then, you know, that would be great. And by the way, that I think also puts the idea of the European Union, European integration as a peace project in a slightly different context, because it's fairly clear that part of the reason that people like Coudenhove-Kalergi and subsequent pro-Europeans are arguing that Europeans must stop fighting wars with each other is precisely the idea that it's undermining their destiny to rule over the rest of mankind.
Okay, thank you very much. And now it's up to you, dear members of the audience. And, well, please first say your name and then ask your question. And we're interested in questions, not in comments of 5 minutes or longer. So, shall we collect 3 questions first? So your question is the first question.
Yeah, thank you also much. My name is Joris. Very interesting talk. I'm ready to buy the book and read it.
Thank you.
I'm surprised that I haven't heard the name of Edward Said in all these points that have been made so far. And I was wondering how his work of Orientalism relates to the book you've written. Maybe he's a part of the book, I wouldn't know, sorry. So this idea that Europe is originates in this study of in a knowledge-power nexus, and maybe to phrase it, maybe give a more critical note to it then. As you are all part of the study of Europe in one way or another, how are you maybe also implicated in this creation of Europe through reinforcing it as a knowledge institute? Because I feel like Europe as a big bureaucratic entity with loads of think tanks and funded university positions is also creating its own knowledge power nexus, to put it that way.
Okay, thank you very much. Then there was a question in the back.
Thanks so much to all of you for being here, to Hans for the book, which I read with great interest. I'm Wiebo Hommes. I work at the Faculty of Laws. I'm a European Union lawyer. So maybe this might become a bit technical. but let's see how far we get. No, I was also reading the book, also listening to you, continuously wondering what do we mean when we discuss the EU? Who are the actors involved? And particularly, sort of, if you could expand a bit on the relation between the EU and the member states, which, in particular, if we're working with somewhat tricky concepts like European identity and memory culture, are not the same. So if we discuss European identity and stay with Anderson, sort of where does identity formation come from? Mass media, education, sports, all things the EU as EU institutions has nothing to do with it. It's a member state thing. If we discuss memory culture, and I think it ties into what Masih was saying before, the EU as a vehicle for colonial amnesia, is it really the EU, or is it very much Western European member states who only recently, when we come to the Netherlands, deal with that colonial past, right? So is it then because of the EU that it's very recent? I'm just wondering if you could say a bit more on that. Finally, Farik, sorry for sort of asking 3 questions in one. You mentioned human rights and the neoliberal turn. And you sort of say, well, it's interesting because the EU gets onto that human rights thing. So I'm just wondering what you mean by that, as sort of the EU and human rights seem to be a bit later when the Charter gets there, which is the early 2000s, or do you mean the internal market freedoms which were there from the beginning?
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions in this first round? In the back?
Thank you. My name is Stephen. I have a question for Mr. Kunani. Thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting. I've been having this question for a while, waiting to ask this to a historian. I guess you're the right person now. A question that's been in my mind a number of times when reading historical books, analyses, is that in my mind, I think sometimes that a writer starts with a conclusion in mind and then cherry picks from history to support the conclusion. I think one could argue that if one were to take different historic data points, one could reach opposite conclusions. So how do you go, I think it's a methodology question largely, how does one go about evading that bias? Let's call it that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Shall we first answer these questions and then have a second round of questions?
Shall I go first? Okay, so first of all, Edward Said. So yeah, Edward Said is not mentioned in the book, actually. And it's actually a good question. I'm not sure, I mean, maybe some of the rest of you, I mean, you might have thoughts on where Edward Said's work might fit into this. I think my immediate reaction to it is that because Edward Said is writing about the West, and so the way I think, I'm writing about Europe, and these are 2 slightly distinct things. So the way I think about this is there are 2 competing civilizationalisms. There's a broader Western civilizationalism. Sam Huntington, when he writes The Clash of Civilizations, imagines that the West is one civilization, Europe and the United States. And then there's a narrower European civilizationalism. And Macron, for example, is very explicit about this. He sees Europe as a civilization that's distinct from the United States. And in fact, the United States is one of the threats to European civilization in Macron's mind, right? So these are 2 slightly different civilizations, and I think the civilizationalisms, sorry, and I think the identity formation, to come to one of the other questions, is slightly different in the 2 cases, actually. I just reviewed a book on this, on the idea of the West, and in a way there's an interesting, I talked about the transition from Christianity to Europeanness. The West is in a way a 3rd stage in this kind of evolution, but the European identity continues to exist alongside it. So that's part of, I think, why I didn't use Said. But then this may also connect to the religion question that you may have thoughts on this as well. Very good question about the member states and the EU institutions. One of the challenges of writing a book about the EU, especially a short book about the EU, is precisely this complexity, right? It's quite difficult because you have to do justice to this complexity, and you have to write about all of the member states. I don't do that. I write about some of them, right? There's a much longer version of this book that would have done that in much more depth. But I think the simple answer to the question is, they interact in some complex ways, and I try to bring that out. So, for example, you said something about memory culture. There I try to show how what happens is that Germany kind of uploads its memory culture to the EU level, particularly what I said about the way in which the Holocaust becomes this central collective memory within the EU. That's largely being driven by Germany, right? And then there are other ways in which, when I talk about the last decade, I think this is kind of complex. I basically tell the story of the civilizational turn in terms of a complex interaction between, Macron, Merkel, and Orban. Right, so there's these complexities, and then at the same time, the EU institutions, sometimes, the simplistic version of this would be to imagine some people want to do, in particular, people who are quite defensive of the EU institutions. They just do what the member states are told, and in a way, what you suggested that perhaps this is actually the fault of the EU member states rather than the EU institutions. That people want to go in that direction sometimes. And I think that underplays the sort of there is a structural way in which the EU institutions and the structure of the EU drive this also. So it's very, very complex is the short answer. In relation to this question of imperial amnesia and this point which several people have come back to around, the EU as a vehicle for amnesia, it's not so much about the intentionality. I'm trying to suggest this is something structural here, which is that, if you have a project which is about trying to bring EU member states closer together, and European integration is nothing if not that, then, as I say, structurally, that encourages you to think about your history in terms of your relationships with each other, right, as opposed to with your former colonies. And this is partly where the Brexit story that I tell comes into this, is that there's an alternative. The EU is often thought of as a community of fate, a Schicksalsgemeinschaft in German, right? Part of my argument about Britain and why I'm optimistic about the EU is my hope is that we can imagine our future in Britain as at least also being part of another community of fate, which is the community of fate of Britain and its former colonies. And so there's a way in which doing that though actually it's a sort of what sometimes people will call a centrifugal force within the EU, because it's pulling you away from each other. It would be, Britain thinking about its relationship, thinking of itself as a community with its former colonies, France doing that with its former colonies. There are a few cases of, say, if you take a country like Cameroon that has been colonized by both France and Germany, you could imagine a Franco-German project of reparations in relation to Cameroon. But unsurprisingly, that project does not exist, right? But in general, this would be something which member states would do on their own, and it would kind of pull them apart in a way, right? So I'm suggesting this is kind of structural. And then the final question about historians and how do you essentially write, a balanced history that isn't, based on your own prejudices? I mean, I'm not sure there's a good answer to that. All I'll say in this case is that, my book is, first of all, not at all meant to be definitive. It's meant to kind of start a debate, and I welcome other people kind of challenging my interpretation. But I think it's also important to say this isn't meant to be a corrective to the thousands of other accounts that exist, which give a very different interpretation.
Yeah, Farid, would you like to answer the question about human rights?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. One of them, can I go back to the one about the EU and member states, the one that you... Yes, I think I think it was important not to underestimate the financial power of EU institutions, what kind of cultural things they fund. So that is, yes, under the directive of what member states agree, but there's a lot of leeway what institutions can fund. In terms of, for example, just things like when we all know the Erasmus exchange program, student exchange program, but there's a lot of things that they fund in the cultural scene, all kind of foundations in all kind of countries, and which you fund and which you don't fund, that is it is a political choice. So I think this is how the EU as an institution is involved in the making of identity, not just the member states. As for the point about human rights, it is of course the main driver of this human rights doctrine or discourse is the United States, and the main target is the Soviet Union. So in the 1970s, I think it was 75, where we had the Helsinki Declaration, also the Helsinki process. So the target is Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. But as a collateral, this drive or these values are being espoused by the European member states and the European Union and put out in all kind of programs later on in the 80s and 90s. And they accompany all the neoliberal policies that were being pushed on the Third World during the debt crisis in the 1980s. And so it is, yes, mostly the target is the Soviet Union and it's the US that is a driving force, but the European Union member states play quite an important role in that as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Nouri, I see that you want to add something about the Said.
Yeah, about Orientalism. I feel like it has almost become an obligation to make a reference to Said and some of these other authors. And sometimes it feels like it's unnecessary to quote someone when you're not really engaging with what it is that they have written, or when you're adding something different. And at the same time, also, the point of member states and the EU as such, I think actually the way that Edward Said says othering strategies work can also be criticized. There is a Oxford professor, Faisal Dewji, who criticizes, for instance, the othering strategies, as Edward Said explains them, by giving the example of the British Empire, which thought of itself as a global partner of pan-Islamists and as a global partner of Muslims. So there are already so many scholarly works on Edward Said, critiques, and also all these references, that I feel like we should also go beyond Said. And it's not just Orientalism, cultural imperialism, all these other works are also worth reading and referencing, but just not in every single book. That's basically my answer.
I'll just add one more sentence. I mean, the very simple answer to why I don't use Said is talking about how the West sees the East. This is a book about how Europe sees itself.
Okay, thank you very much. And then there's another round of questions. This gentleman in front here. Oh, the lady in the back first. Yeah.
Thank you for this interesting panel. I want to ask Hans about the role of the Soviet Union and now Russia, because it was mentioned, and I guess my question is broadly, what role does it play in this construction of Euro whiteness, and are they included? But my question is prompted by the comment about Germany, about having to Germany uploading its memory culture at the level of the EU, and I wonder if part of the reason for that is obvious. You have to defeat, domesticate, and integrate a newly reunited Germany into the EU. And given that Germany has done at least as much or more damage within Europe than it ever did to other colonies, that to me seems like the structural reason for why a certain EU Germany's role in creating this inward-looking way of thinking about Europe reconciling its own differences because it's the biggest economic powerhouse, and you see. But then the problem is that it has to do that against the Soviet Union, and it has to do that against Russia, because 27 million Russians, Soviets died, and they won the war, and you have to create a counter-narrative to that, and you have to kind of absorb it and do something with it. So it strikes me that I don't really understand Russia seems to be quite an important force here, but I'm not understanding the role that it plays, and maybe some of that makes sense to you. But.
Okay, thank you very much. The gentleman in blue.
Yes, my name is Gijs, and it actually taps into the other question because I was wondering about the relationship between European integration and different narratives of accession of different member states. Because I feel, especially if you look at Central and Eastern Europe, the Soviet imperialism plays a very large role in the motives of different member states to join the EU. Yeah. And one term that has also been used by actors in Central and Eastern Europe is the relationship of colonialism, right, between Soviet Union and these Central European nations. Yeah. And I was just wondering to what extent this, maybe perceived shared experience of colonialism has in any way informed the bilateral engagement with these member states, with former colonies of Western European member states.
Okay, thank you very much. And there was another question, right, or not? Yes, one more question from Laura.
Hi, my name is Laura. Thank you very much for the interesting talks. And I think my question also links to the former two. I thought it was to the former two questions, because I thought it was interesting that you made the decision between the West and Europe. And I was wondering, what were the narratives with which the US were othered? Did that happen, or like what were the stories which made Europe different from the US?
Okay. So, Lillian, I'll be brief and we can talk about it more afterwards. Yeah, very, very briefly, Russia, actually I don't think Russia does play a huge part in this story of European integration, except, you know, that obviously it begins in the context of the Cold War, and there's a certain kind of, you know, it is to some extent an communist project. That's fairly clear. But I don't think it does actually play a huge role. And then, you know, on your point about Germany, I don't think it's quite right that somehow Russia is central to this, the evolution of the Holocaust memory in Germany. Because actually, or the GDR, you know, the reunification context after the end of the Cold War. Because actually, this all really, you know, the decisive moment. This is all before 1989. Actually, this has already essentially been developed by the 1980s, the German Holocaust kind of memory culture, and then it's, you know. And even though it's already started to be uploaded to the EC, as it was then, level, and then after the Cold War even more so. But it's not, I don't think the Cold War is decisive here at all. That brings me then to this question of Central and Eastern Europe. I've got a lot to say about this. Let me try to be brief. I think, I don't share your optimism that this can be a way of sort of either bringing Europeans together or getting them to engage with colonial histories, because, I mean, I reject the idea that, I mean, I certainly think you can talk about Russian imperialism in Central and Eastern Europe. I don't think you can talk about Russian colonialism. I think this is actually an abuse of the term colonialism, and lots of Central and Eastern Europeans want to think of it as colonialism, but that's because they're not interested in the history of European colonialism, and they completely elide the difference between colonialism and imperialism. All colonialism is imperialism, but not all imperialism is colonialism. And I just don't think, you know, it may be the case that we can talk about Russian colonialism in, say, Central Asia, but I don't think in Central and Eastern Europe you can talk about that. You know, another example to bring this to the Dutch context, you know, I don't think, for example, you can talk about Nazi colonialism during the occupation of Holland. It wasn't colonialism, right? Yeah, I think you can talk about, you know, German colonialism in Poland and in Eastern Europe, but I think it's wrong to call it colonialism in the case of the occupation. I say that as somebody with a Dutch mother and a grandfather who lived through that period and was in the Dutch resistance. And so actually I see this tendency in Central and Eastern Europe saying, no, we're the victims of colonialism or even imperialism, is actually really something rather dangerous, because I think what it's doing, and this actually brings us back to your point about amnesia, I think what's happening is increasingly people are saying, well, you know, some Europeans were victims of colonialism, some are perpetrators, and it all kind of cancels each other out. We don't really need to think about this anymore. So I think that the embryonic engagement with the history of European colonialism is essentially sort of in danger of being killed off right now. I think it's really worrying. And then finally, as I could say a whole lot more about this, I've been having this argument quite a lot since Euro Whiteness came out. Finally, on this question of, Laura, on the question of the US, Europe in the form of the EU and the United States have a really complex kind of relationship. Again, I need a long time to sort of get into this in any depth, but I think the short version would be, there's a way in which the European project begins as an American project. You know, the Marshall Plan, it's the Americans that encourage Europeans to, you know, cooperate economically. And, you know, it's interesting, Monet, you know, very close to the Americans, you know, seen by some as an American agent, actually. Then there's a moment, and Suez, I think, is the critical juncture. There's a wonderful moment when Konrad Adenauer happens to be in Paris at the time of the Suez crisis, you know, and the French feel betrayed by the Americans because of American opposition to the Anglo-French-Israeli invasion. And Konrad Adenauer says to Guy Mollet, who's the French prime minister at the time, "You must build Europe, it will be your revenge." You know, so there's this way in which, from that moment on, I think, at the very latest, there's also a current, which is particularly strong in France, of European integration as a kind of an anti-American project, this idea of building up a counterweight to American power. And this, by the way, goes back to this idea goes back further to the interwar period. People like Richard Kudinov-Kalergi talking about Europe as a third force in international politics that would be able to sort of assert itself both, against American materialism and Soviet materialism, a spiritual Europe contrasted with these two different materialisms, right? So that's part of the othering of the United States. And all of this stuff then kind of continues up to the present day. It reaches another high point, I think, during the Iraq War. And this sense that, Europe stands for a kind of more, in a funny way, this is also where there's even a sort of slight revival of this kind of civilizing thinking in relation to the United States, right? Because the way that even people like Jürgen Habermas and Jacques Derrida put this at the time of the Iraq War is we are more civilized than the Americans, right? Because we believe in human rights and so on in a way that the Americans don't. So that's the sort of way that in which the United States is othered.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid that we ran out of time, so we have to end this debate. I'm very sorry about that. But the good news is now there will be drinks, and you will have the opportunity to chat with all the speakers and have a glass of wine or something else. Many thanks to the audience for your questions. Many thanks for the speakers for their talks and their comments. Thank you very much, and, well, have a nice evening. Thank you.